Hello, welcome. It's always a funny moment when you move from being live in your own in your own study. Thanks very much for joining us. We're really excited to have so many people here and be part of hopefully a really interesting conversation about immersive audiences. This is one of those Zoom calls where it is genuinely exciting to think about who all the people are in the Zoom windows out in the world out there. And the reason that we can't see you for a change is not because you've turned off your cameras and are multitasking or eating lunch or doodling away, but because there are so many of you, we can't fit you on the screen. We've got about 150 people out there today, which we really encourage you to see this as a chance to have a conversation with hopefully the report that we've shared with you, and we'll put in the chat for you to link through to and browse as we discuss some of its findings with our great panel. The format of the event today is really much about having a conversation. So we'll kick off with a short introduction from Ben Luxford, the head of audiences at the BFI, and then we'll have 6 lightning presentations from our research team about key highlights from the report. We'll then introduce our audience toolkit, which is you'll find at the back of the report, and we hope will become a valuable tool for anyone in the industry or academia or cultural institutions working with immersive, that for thinking about planning for audiences. And then we'll invite our esteemed panel to join the conversation. Sarah Ellis from the RSC, Katie Scott-Sonnion from the National Gallery, Simon Parnell from Ofcom to join the conversation. But I'll introduce those people shortly. Where I want to start is hopefully the report that you've now got in your hands, or just clicking through to the link that the wonderful Bee, who is organising the event today, has shared. Hopefully the first thing you'll notice is this is a pretty big study. It draws on 5 different kinds of data from over 2,000 users. It's a study that's stretched over 2 years and combines psychology, media studies, anthropology, marketing, and cultural theory. Our work has studied a range of audience-facing prototypes. It's undertaken a long-term audience habit study. It's done 3 national surveys and more. And it's been compiled by a team who come from a range of different disciplines, who I want to just invite to say, to do a quick wave hello as we go around. So let me quickly introduce you to the team. Professor Polly Dalton from psychology, Larissa Whitaker from media arts and ethnography, Isabel Verhoost from psychology, Andy Woods from engineering and psychology, Chloe Priest from marketing and business, and Professor Olga Goryanova from media arts. We think the combination of disciplines, of methods and data sets that we pulled together makes this kind of report unique. And although we would not claim the report is comprehensive, this is not, for example, a study of VR or AR games, although they do feature. We think that it is something that pulls together a range of different ways of thinking about immersive that are important for trying to help the sector grow, trying to give audiences new ways of experiencing storytelling, and trying to understand the potentiality of the medium. Couple of final notes before I introduce Ben. As with anything in the last year, this has been subject to the usual pressures of COVID and the pandemic. But I think what's been a unique challenge in terms of researching audiences is that our audiences have been reduced from being real human beings that we could talk to, that we could hand devices to, that we could engage on locations and interact with, to now being reduced to pixels on our screen. And reaching audiences for experimental prototypes, for testing and research has been a challenge, not only in terms of research, but also for the industry as a whole. With thanks to the brilliant Andy Woods in our team and support from EM3LEP and the brilliant team at Figment, we've been able to create SF Panel that we'll put a link to in the chat for people to have a look at. It enables us to continue to reach and test prototypes with audiences throughout the pandemic. And next week, we'll see us launch a cloud XR-based integration for testing VR prototypes in a secure environment. With the BFI, we've been launching a study with Massive that will allow us to look at 60 youth users spread across the UK over the next 6 months. So this research is really, the start of more to come. A couple of thank yous, and then I'll introduce Ben. I'd just like to say that, the research wouldn't be possible without the support of amazing people in our network, like Catherine Aaron at Limina, Tim Fines at the BBC, and our brilliant companies and creators we work with. People like To Play For, Focal Point VR, Story Things, Surround Vision, Shola Amu and Nell Whiteley. But also our larger partners like BBC Three, Discovery, Heathrow, all of whom are trying out immersive in mainstream context to find out what they can do with audiences. So we'll spend more time getting into the discussion of the findings, but let me first introduce Ben Luxford, who is head of UK audiences at the BFI, where his role is to bring great UK content to cinema audiences. Ben's been flat out over the last year leading the Cultural Recovery Fund at the British Film Institute since the pandemic began. And it's been brilliant to know that we've got somebody leading that who has had also an eye on not just great content, but also ensuring cinemas and the film sector think about immersive. Ben's been a great supporter of the immersive sector and where it intersects with great storytelling traditions in the UK screen industries. From supporting works like Darren Emerson's Common Ground and research around how cinemas can show this sort of work, through to ensuring immersive is on the table at film festivals. We're really excited to have a conversation across our panel today that kicks off with film, but through the presence of the panel brings in live venues, brings in cultural institutions, and brings in broadcast regulation to think about the future of immersive. But let me hand it over to Ben now to say a few words.
Thanks, James. It was very nice. As James has mentioned, I haven't just been roped in for this panel today. We are the BFI has been heavily involved with StoryFutures since the inception of the project. Among the varied multitude of things we do at the BFI, we do have a central role, and that is an absolute commitment to storytellers and audiences. So that's why we've been so interested in the work that StoryFutures have done and are doing and continue to do, in order for us to ensure that we know how to deliver on that central role and central commitment of ours to storytellers and audiences, because their expectations are going to grow, they're going to change, and they're going to develop their mediums, canvases, and we need to be a part of that and help them to do that. So I know it might look weird to some that the BFI, the British Film Institute, is so involved rather than just continuing to make 90-minute feature films that are projected on real 35mm films in cinemas. But we have to continue to show leadership in its broadest sense, and offer continued support to an ever-evolving industry. We're of the belief, and thankfully it's not just a belief, StoryFutures are doing all the hard work and evidencing it, that the more storytellers will be drawn, to immersive. The world building potential and engagement of a captive audience is exciting to creators. And the evidence you'll see today about the growth of audiences engaging with these forms is compelling. Already our production slate and audience activity, including our own expanded strand at the London Film Festival, the BFI London Film Festival, is supporting a range of immersive projects as the skills, market and demand continues to develop. And we are so pleased to be helping with that development. So I hope you enjoy the conversation today, but obviously do read the report as well. Don't just listen to us, read it. And now I'm going to hand over to the StoryFutures research team, who will share some of the findings. Thank you.
Hello, so hopefully you can see and hear me. So my name's Andy Woods. At the start of the year, we tested 1,000 people, and we called this our immersive sample. And people we tested were broadly similar to that of the UK population, perhaps a bit younger, perhaps a bit smarter. People did the tests in their own homes, and sadly that's the new state of play given COVID. We surveyed people through our SF panel, which James mentioned, It's an app we developed in response to COVID to test people on their own hardware in their own homes. So some of the findings, perhaps not surprisingly, we found that augmented reality was used by many more people in contrast to virtual reality. We also found that 22% of women use augmented reality filters daily, and this is in contrast to only 9% of men. For me, the key takeaway, though, is that we do seem to be on the tipping point when it comes to AR. We have smartphones in everyone's pockets, and people grab their smartphones and take 3D pictures and post them on Facebook without even thinking. This is Harry Potter territory and the unthinkable 10 years ago. And we have the big players like Apple and Google baking in augmented reality functionality straight into people's handsets and creating awesome developer toolkits to allow us to do this. Let me pass over to Chloe.
So another key finding is that across immersive media, people want to engage together rather than alone. We undertook an immersive histories survey where nearly 200 users told us about a whole range of immersive experiences that they'd been part of, nearly 250 of these. And overwhelmingly, these experiences were social. So they were either involved, kind of directly engaged with somebody else virtually, or they engaged with others who were present, either observing or participating in the experience. So this runs counter to the popular imagination that immersive experiences are isolating and demonstrates resounding preference to engage in immersive activities socially. In our longitudinal study, we also found a very strong desire by young participants to use their VR headsets socially. So the headset was perceived by our participants as primarily a family-oriented console, particularly by gamers who found that the content wasn't challenging enough for long stretches of use, but very accessible and fun to play in groups for shorter time periods. They noted that it was perfect for holidays, for special occasions, with the whole family present, allowing for interaction between different generations. So in the photo, you can see one of our participants showing her grandmother how to use the headset while being kind of observed bemusedly by the familial dog. So social situations were really the foremost motivator for our participants to get their headsets out. And participants repeatedly highlighted their delight at sharing their VR headsets and really curating first-time VR experiences for their friends and families to introduce this medium to them. So very few genres of VR are actually set up for multiplayer use, but we found that our participants really adapted in order to make these experiences social. They actively sought workarounds to make the VR experience a more social activity through, for example, screencasting and screen sharing. And I'm now passing on to Larissa.
So our studies have made a comprehensive analysis as well at the types of barriers that people are facing, both in incorporating virtual reality into home environments and in engaging location-based VR experiences. And we call these frictions because they don't necessarily stop people from engaging in VR, but they do slow things down and they can accumulate to make them decide not to continue or not to re-engage. And looking at this has pointed out several different things, significant things. With VR, the immersive experience is not just the time in the headset. It starts well before the person picks up the headset and it continues after they finish. And in the home, I can just zoom in here. Maybe I can't zoom in, it's a little too big now, so sorry about that. In the home, these blue bars here represent the various contextual frictions, such as people's work and study lives or duties and obligations. And those compete against what is seen as a kind of leisure engagement. It takes a bit of extra work. Since the logistical frictions here in red, like making sure the headset is charged, having to move the coffee table, or find some free space in the home, not being able to engage with others while you're in real life, while you're in the headset. Those are really important considerations. And these investments, plus then the physical toll that the experience takes on them, can cause them to reconsider whether this investment that's required to engage is actually worthwhile. And in location-based experiences, important physical frictions such as cyber sickness or contextual or social ones, about concern about looking silly or knowing what to do, those have an impact on people's willingness to engage. And it's highlighted for us the importance of planning for and resourcing onboarding and offboarding procedures. And significantly, whether at home or at location-based experiences, people do still consider the amount of content that's available as a concern. In fact, the lack of content is the single most significant reason that people reported not spending more time in the headset. 97 people mentioned that. They want more variety and more options. And I'll hand over to Olga.
Virtual reality is wasted on reality. This is a quote from one of our participants, and here lies the cultural value of VR. VR is an intimate medium. It breaks personal space, and it allows the users to experience physical and virtual proximity in ways that is unmatched by other mediums. We characterize such proximity and intimacy as allowing for new perspectives, new ways of seeing. Such new ways of seeing can be directed outwards towards literally new worlds constituted in a different way. Our participants enjoyed escaping into such structured story worlds, particularly if they were unusual and distinctive from their own realities, and gave them a sense of being on a journey. Our participants were also seeking out of this world experiences. They saw VR as particularly impactful when it allowed them to escape things that they have in their real life and experience things that they couldn't experience in real life. VR also allows users to access interior imaginaries, to look inwardly into the unknown depths of their own imagination. A number of our participants compared VR to dreaming. More surreal, narrative-less VR experiences felt emotional and empowering to our participants. Content which allowed participants to live out their fantasies was prized, and this often meant providing users with a point of view which is ordinarily inaccessible. Overall, we suggest that the cultural value of VR lies in the construction of new ways of seeing, new perspectives, and new worlds instead of a wide-known emphasis on empathy. A great political potential lies precisely here in the access to a different world. And now I hand over to Isabel.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk about a concept called presence. And that means basically is defined as the feeling of being there in a virtual experience, feeling captivated and really present, and feeling that the experience that you're in is real. Presence can really be thought of as a success measure. Not only did we and other researchers consistently find that the user's sense of presence in an immersive context strongly correlates with their overall enjoyment, we did an analysis of data of 4 of our major StoryFutures immersive experiences recently, and we found that people's sense of presence in the experience predicts both their levels of enjoyment and to which extent they want to repeat it. But then what predicts presence? We found that the level to which participants enjoyed the experience, them feeling happy, and or them using a more immersive device, all predicted their level of presence. For example, in a project we did with the National Gallery, those visitors who used a virtual reality VR headset reported higher presence levels than those who use augmented reality or AR headsets. This is because VR offers higher technical immersion levels than AR does generally. Similarly, in another immersive experience, people who used VR reported higher presence than those using a traditional 2D computer screen. And you can read more about these 2 examples in the reports in the case studies. Safe to say, presence is a key prize in immersive experiences. And now here to present the next slide is Professor Polly Dalton.
Thanks, Isabel. So I'm going to be talking today about emotional responding to our experiences. And what we're finding is that although immersive storytelling may not currently have the reach of some of the more mainstream media, like film, TV, and games, one of the things that it does offer is this potential to target particular emotional responses that can then potentially impact people's behaviour. So perhaps unsurprisingly, one emotion that's come out fairly consistently as being important across our immersive experiences is happiness. And the happier that a person feels in an experience, the more likely they are to enjoy it and want to repeat it. As I said, perhaps not such a surprising finding, particularly because we're talking here primarily about entertainment type experiences, where you might expect that happiness would be an outcome that you'd want to target. But of course, not every experience will be attempting to make people feel happy. And this highlights this interesting point that you can target different types of emotional responding according to the nature of the experience that you're creating. So just one quick example of this comes from AI Spy, which was run at Broadgate in London and created by To Play For. And this was an artificial intelligence driven experience of a simulated spy interview. So the user's being interviewed for a potential role as a spy. Now here, we didn't see that link between happiness and enjoyment, but instead it was feelings such as excitement, amusement, and the sense that the experience was creepy that were associated with overall enjoyment. So that's just one example of how we can target different emotional responses according to the nature of the particular experience, and we're finding evidence that audiences do respond to that. So that concludes our whistle-stop tour of some of the highlights of the report, and I'll now pass over to the team to outline the audience toolkit that we've been developing.
Thank you. So I'm going to introduce the audience framework. So our audience toolkit is an analytical tool which has emerged from the 2 years of research that we've been doing with immersive audiences across multiple StoryFutures and StoryFutures Academy projects. At its basis is a system of coordinates, which you can see here, which are formed by two axes, one stretched between place and time and the other between platform and genre. At the heart of the framework are the users whose experience is shaped by all four of those elements. So the framework is designed to be used iteratively throughout the process of designing and developing an immersive experience. It serves to ground any experience in a wider consideration of the affordances of the technology being used and the characteristics of the audience it's speaking to. It is also of use in analyzing audience responses to the completed experience. So if we zoom into the expanded framework, please, Larissa. Thank you. So you can see there's a whole series of question prompts that we have kind of provided in order to kind of start people using this to have some idea of like how to consider these various elements. So if we focus on users, the term user refers to the person or people, if there's more than one, who are engaging in the experience. So users can differ between each other, both in characteristics which are more fixed, demographics, for example, but they can also kind of differ based on their current moods, current goals. So this can vary in very kind of short periods of time. These differing user characteristics will obviously impact on people's responses to immersive experiences, sometimes in ways that can be more systematic and somewhat predictable. So for example, we know that women tend to experience cyber sickness more than men, but they can also impact in much less obvious ways. For example, our research found that young users use VR headsets to unwind as a respite from multiple other screens, digital devices that demand their attention. So really, it's not about applying the framework in very prescriptive ways, but rather allowing for reflection on the various user needs and characteristics. So users in this sense are not passive recipients of technology or content, but rather active participants who decide to engage in the experience because they perceive it as worthwhile. If we consider the place and time axis, so this helps us kind of position and understand the immersive experience within the flow of everyday life. So in our framework, place comprises location, space, and place. So location usually means a specific point on the map. Space refers to an abstract space. So for example, an arrangement of elements that comprise, for instance, an arcade without being any specific arcade. And place is a location created through human experience. So it has specific objectives and emotional meanings. So our place works across all three meanings. So for instance, if we take the National Gallery as an example, it's an abstract space of a museum. It's a specific building at a known location. And it's a place with rich histories of meaning that extend from personal memories as well as the history of art and its values. So people make places out of spaces and locations as they organize the world around themselves, and that's how these places become meaningful. If we move on to time, we can also explore the relationship between the factor of time and the immersive experience. So one element of this is the time of day or the day of the week when the immersive experience actually takes place. So for example, whether there are any habitual correlations or preferred use cases related to particular times of day. Another element is the duration of the immersive activity. For example, the length of time the user actually spends in a headset or on a device on any given day or occasion. So this includes both the objective measurable duration of activity, but also the subjective experience of time. So losing track of time, for instance, can be an indicator of engagement and immersion. And I'll now pass on to Larissa to describe platform and genre.
So when we're talking about platforms, we're of course talking about devices in some ways. So by this term platform, we're talking about more than that, though. We're also talking about the genres of socio-technical sort of complexes that each of these devices sits on. So platforms can be thought of as spanning this political, regulatory, social, technical parameters that frame the way that the different devices function. And devices exploit different potentials of each of those parameters. And we need to consider that the overall ecosystem of devices that sits in that platform. So when we want to think about platform in that way, we don't want to have a false sort of dichotomy between hardware and software. I can illustrate it with a more practical example. So while virtual reality is a platform and HTC Vive is one of the major VR devices on the market, other devices such as Valkyrie's haptic gloves sit within that VR platform, but are part of a specific device ecosystem that's aligned to HTC Vive. So these kinds of configurations we've outlined in some more detail in the report, but thinking about, the affordance of these devices for the experience is a really important part of centering it, again, based on what the user perspective will be. And to just finish up with genre, again, thinking about genre, of course, that's a word we're familiar with. It refers to the type of experience like sci-fi, horror, or nature documentary. And those kinds of genres tend to warrant specific kinds of interaction and experience. And user experience design is significant here in creating and maximizing the desired impact. So for example, in a story-driven dialogue where presence is key, then the user design has to be not developed so as not to disrupt this sense of presence. And you can think of UX design both in terms of the way users interact with the immersive environment via software, and in terms of the way this interaction is restricted or enhanced by the software and hardware design of the device itself. And different mechanisms can offer different actions, deliver different actions depending on the genre. So for example, the trigger interaction mechanic in a sci-fi game, that can mean shooting a gun, but the same mechanic in a museum experience can be used to explore an object. So given that immersive media aren't fully yet developed as a media in their own right, the genres associated with them are also always being redefined and not also always precisely definable. So using genre as a tool helps us, again, to adapt to the changing meanings that users are attributing. And it's worth remembering that genre considerations are one of the most important factors in determining whether or not a user is going to be interested in an experience. So thinking about genre can really guide that. And that is our tool. We hope that it's going to be useful to you.
Thanks, Larissa. I think with the tool, one of the things in particular we noticed with practitioners making is that some of these things are what is intuitively thought through by producers as they work through the ideas of what an immersive experience will be like and who is it for. So in some ways it's articulating what is intuitive to people with experience. For those people who are newer to starting to create immersive, it's a bit of a guide rail for thinking about what are the issues that you need to consider in making a successful immersive experience. And hopefully for other researchers, it's a way of thinking about what immersive offers in terms of different audience interactions. But what I want to do now is bring in our panel, our esteemed panel, to have a discussion around some of the highlights from the research. We've pulled together a really amazing set of knowledge about the immersive sector in the UK media industries, and we've designed the panel to reflect different areas of interest from our creative industries across cultural institutions, live venues, the film industry and regulatory bodies. And we wanted to draw these different areas together around the intersection and concern with audiences, obviously, to discuss some of the findings, share problems in how we develop immersive and how we understand audiences' responses to immersive experiences and storytelling. So our panel, very briefly, you've met Ben Luxford already, the head of UK audiences at the British Film Institute. We're also a great pleasure to be joined by Casey Scott-Sonnion, the Senior Manager and Data of Insights at the National Gallery. Casey is overseeing the audience research and insight of the National Gallery's continuing work to innovate with immersive, from projects like our own virtual Veronese through to a current project we're working on with StoryFutures China, through to the Leonardo exhibition and the most recent Gossard exhibitions. We're also joined by Simon Parnell of Ofcom. Simon was formerly at BBC R&D, where he's helped the BBC and other broadcasters think about the potential of a range of new disruptive and digital technologies. He's now Principal Advisor for broadcast technology at Ofcom. And finally, the award-winning Sarah Ellis, Director of Digital Development for the Royal Shakespeare Company. Sarah has really pioneered the use of immersive technologies in the live performance sector, most recently leading on the Audience of the Future Project Dream, but her list of credits and leadership in the sector is far longer than I can share here, and it's a pleasure to have you all with us. So how we're going to do this is just ask a lead question of one of the panelists and use that to kick off discussion. Please do out there in Zoom land use it as an opportunity to ask questions that we will either come to during the discussion or bring in at the end of our short panel discussion. But if I can kick off with a question to Simon about some of our kind of like our quantitative findings about changing audiences' behaviours and the uptake of AR and this being our tipping point. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what Ofcom are seeing in future behaviours in any market data, or perhaps even how the pandemic has impacted behaviours around it.
Thank you. I'm reminded actually that Ofcom was actually involved in some original work in VR, actually in the 1990s with Johnny Freeman at Goldsmiths. So a man you'll know well. You quoted the uptake as moving from 1 in 20 to 1 in 17, which of course isn't a vast increase. But you talked about the pandemic. I'll give you some stats. One of the exciting things that happened last year was that the number of people who don't have broadband and internet connectivity in the UK fell from 11% down to 6%. That just because of the pandemic, quite a remarkable decrease. And Zoom, for example. Zoom started off last February with 130,000 users in the UK. Well, I would like to take bets on what it was by April. Well, you'll be amazed. It had risen by 10,000% to 13 million. So we went from 130,000 to 13 million. An awful lot of those people who started using this new technology were people obviously who were hitherto not using it, such as the elderly. So, for example, I've got some stats here. In the in the brackets of the over 65s, the number who are using it rose from 22% weekly to 61%. I mean, these figures were absolutely staggering. So one of the things you can draw on is that people are prepared to change. And certainly this new technology is incredibly exciting in terms of what it offers. I'm sure you're going to ask about some of the technical and other frictions later. But I just want to pick on one, if I may, the content one. You know, it's wonderful to see, for example, David Hockney, the way he embraced the iPad as an art form. And actually, when people actually get to use this new medium in an exciting way and explore what it can do. And of course, it's not the same, you know, an iPad is not the same as oil, but you can do different things with it. And I think that area there is an immensely exciting one. Once creatives get hold of this new medium, it's amazing to see what is produced.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's really interesting statistics about like the way in which we're seeing some changing uses of home technologies. And I wonder, Andy, that stuff that we looked at in the wider survey about some uptakes and changes. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what we were seeing in some of the data about changing audience behaviours?
So, given the time when we undertook the research right in the center of the pandemic, I think the key thing was the absolutely massive uptake of these augmented reality and mobile phone technologies, and this kind of coincided as well with the manufacturers both reducing their prices of their next generation products. The Quest 2 is $100 cheaper than the Quest 1, and updating their products as well. So not only have we got a cheaper product, we got a better product as well. This is really, really enticing for the people stuck at home, needing some distraction from the horrible times we're in, really. And it just seems like dare I say it, a perfect storm, as it were, for immersive acceptance for the world that we live in at the moment.
Thanks, Andy. Simon, I don't know if you wanted to come back on any of that at all in terms of stuff that Ofcom is seeing.
Well, I think the points just made actually are very true about some of the frictions. You know, in terms of, for example, the accessibility of the technology is a clear one that actually is a concern. I think we're going to talk later about harms and the potential there, and Larissa made a very good presentation about that. I mean, I spent some time in Johnny Freeman's lab, and I really should have been in a padded cell at the time because of the risks to yourself. And we're establishing a new lab in Riverside House, which is going to enable us to explore these kind of technologies, amongst other, and actually for people who are interested in strategy, policy, etc., to be able to actually explore what this new media means to them too. So yeah, I think that Andy makes some really good points there.
That's really exciting to hear about the lab. We'll draw you on more detail on that as we go on. But let me move on to one of our other findings and a discussion point there that we wanted to bring in, which if I can bring Ben into the conversation here about the finding that we had around immersive being social. And I think this was one of the findings that I guess we were surprised about and delighted about in terms of looking at long-term behaviors and seeing the way in which people made sense of VR in particular in their lives. And immersive adoption has maybe been characterized as a technology of isolation and single user syndrome, particularly around headsets. But the research suggests that maybe we worry about that too much. And I wonder how this kind of this research might impact the BFI and other funders about thinking about how you commission, how you think about audiences for immersive.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think it gives us two main things to continue to tackle that we have been throughout our time. You know, really engaging with immersive projects. One is it's great to have that validation that it is a social experience. Storytelling has always fundamentally been a communal, social experience. So there's now, with that validation, there's a depth of exploration that creatives can undertake now about what does that really look like in a storyteller environment. Is that about a shared experience within a worldscape? Is that about actually, a shared soundscape, but everyone having an individual visuals? All of those types of things are ripe for kind of exploration by a creative and a storyteller now. So because that actually people do want to do this together. Like everything that I think it was Chloe was outlining was very familiar to the old video market. It's like people take it home at Christmas, maybe buy some more games, get the whole family engaged, bring in grandma, all of that type of stuff. That's something that HMV have known about for years, for example. So we know that there's kind of a we know that it's following a traditional trend of entertainment, which is really, really encouraging and ripe for exploration. But being at the BFI, being a bunch of old film execs, what we actually then spend most of our time worrying about is then what does the economy for immersive actually look like? Because now that we're or what will it look like? Because if there's going to be investment beyond funders, and we know that there is investment out there, we've always got the kind of games market beating us up and showing us that there is investment out there. Investment in entertainment, in just on storytelling, on a storytelling basis, what does that look like? What does the economy look like? And therefore, what does the exploitation look like? So in terms of when we're talking about funding, either not activity, when we're talking about funding projects, how do we how do we visualize how people are going to engage with that? Are they in a room somewhere? If they're in a room, what's the turnover of audiences like? Is it everyone just in their headsets, from a platform? What does that actually look like? That's what we're really talking about, because there's a tension there, and there's a frustration in now that we know absolutely it's social, it's communal, and there is engagement. So what are we talking about when we talk about when we talk about investment?
Well, can I bring you in there, because you've seen audiences in so many different contexts working to make it social.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a kind of huge topic, and there's lots of different kind of possible paths. But I think there definitely is something about the excitement of a social experience. So I mean, it's clear that with our participants, they really kind of loved, for example, they were just all picturing kind of Christmas around the tree as a family with the VR headset. And really enjoyed kind of showing their parents who weren't into gaming at all, but still getting them into the experience. So the social aspect was really something that we weren't necessarily expecting as much as it was. In terms of the kind of different pathways, I mean, it's obviously kind of finding the right model is difficult. I think there's various kind of potential models. I think there's the kind of headsets at home. Obviously, they're getting cheaper, so there is that possible of kind of using it as a family device and finding new ways to kind of use it as such. But then for places like the BFI, I think, maybe even if the experience is still individual, so you're in a headset, so therefore it's individual, there's a real potential in terms of kind of creating a social experience around that in terms of what happens after they've watched whatever it is. So actually just having a space for kind of discussion afterwards and talking to each other in the cafe, and making it sociable in that kind of sense. So yeah, and then maybe getting them to buy lots of drinks, which perhaps can help with the, the monetary side of things.
It's one of the bits I love in the War of the Worlds experience, where you find yourself deposited in the bar in the middle. It's a very happy moment. I wonder if just on this topic, Sarah or Casey, it rang true with anything with you wanted to share? Either of you wanted to share?
Yeah, sure. So we did a project called Virtual Veronese at the National Gallery. And I'll talk a bit more about that later, I think. But basically, there were two different experiences you could choose from once you were in the VR headset. And what we found was, we assumed people would have very individual experiences. You could choose one that was like a curator who was a bit, it was a bit more informational versus an abbot, which sort of told a story in a more narrative way. But what ended up happening is we saw people would go in, together to experience them through the VR headsets. And then afterwards, they'd just sit in the gallery and compare notes about, oh, I wish I had done this one, or this one was like this. And there was a lot of conversation where they were talking about the two different stories and what they had each gotten out of it, which ended up making a lot of people want to then do it again to see the other thing. So it became quite an interesting circle of repeat usage as well, as that social aspect is starting to get people to want to experience more parts of the experience itself.
Yeah, it's nice. Sarah, is there anything you wanted to chime in on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really fortunate enough to work with an art form that has always been immersive and social, and actually the use of these tools and technologies allows us to experiment with ways we can achieve that. And all I've seen, particularly in this time of when that social deprivation that we've all felt, I've seen people just want to show up and are finding their own ways. And as makers, we're making and we're looking at this work and we're architecting. And actually what we're being shown is that we're being reaffirmed of all the cultural and social behaviors that have existed, our ecosystems in society, which means that I think we can move forward quite confidently with these immersive technologies. Where I'm really super interested about it is, can we remove some of the traditional analog tropes that we've been working with, and what are the new forms of entertainment that are truly of this form, and how do we architect those and use and sort of co-create that with an audience perspective? Because this generation of audiences are makers, they're creators. So we have a whole creator economy as well as a maker economy of our own, and how do we converge that and bring that together is just really exciting. And not look at the homogenized audience, but like the toolkit suggests, look at the breaking down of audience behaviors and unpicking that. That's very exciting, to not look at content as this big thing, but actually look at multiple pathways for that content. It's great.
That's really interesting, and to take that comfort in familiar behaviours. I'm going to make my next question quick because I've got scaffolding outside my window on a perfect day for it. So I'm actually going to come back to you, Sarah, and ask one of the focuses around this of trying to engage audiences in it, and this discussion we're having about familiarity, is the onboarding and offboarding processes, and what that looks like from your point of view. And when it starts, does it start from the moment you buy the ticket, and how do you start? Like you say, you've got this, theatre's always been immersive, where you bring the technology and how you ensure that complementarity from your point of view.
I think that's so true. I think that I bang on about it quite a lot, but the rituals around theatre, sorry if you've heard me talk before, but I'm really obsessed with it. But it is, when you buy a ticket, there's a contract that you make there's a transaction that you make, and therefore people are mapping out their experience before they get to the content or whatever. And Dream, which was our demonstrator project for the Audience of the Future collaboration, some of the most shared content was actually people. We created a lobby experience, so people came into the experience feeling good about it, feeling welcomed, knowing how best to experience it, looking at the different types of audiences. Some may be really confident, some won't. And the most shared aspect of that, and also the unexpected delight for us, I think, was how audiences owned that hour before, and they were talking to each other, they were sharing how many people were joining, they knew they were showing up, and they knew they were part of something. And in the process of Dream, we were quite obsessed with the performer audience relationship, but I'm like, oh my goodness, actually it's the audience to audience relationships and all of those sort of bubbles and ecosystems of connection. And so for us, what the opportunity that immersive tech affords us is this technology, this storytelling technology is with you all the time, ultimately. So as soon as we know that we're going to have a performance together, we have a connection with you, and we can create a dialogue, we can create a story, we can also create pathways to imagine and bring that audience in closer to us. Those are all opportunities. And it's not a broadcast situation, it's very much a distributed, persistent world that we can create for our storytellers now. And that in terms of narrative and engagement, from an audience perspective is incredibly interesting when we're looking at a whole generation of creators.
That's so interesting. I think I'll bring Ben into this conversation as well in a second, but I wanted to get Larissa's kind of response and sort of, because I think that onboarding process has been so important. But Larissa, I'll hand to you, and then maybe bring Ben in about how, because cinema's got this sort of relationship with the audience, can both learn from and draw upon and inspire ways that we engage with audiences from the foyer to the ticket purchase to the moment you come back again. Larissa?
Yeah, I think that's actually quite interesting. And that was one of the fascinating things about Dream With Me, actually, when I saw it, actually, was just how well integrated into that whole experience the onboarding was. It was, it was just built in. It wasn't an extra add-on. It was part of the experience. And I think the thing that you're talking about with, recognizing the individuality of people too, I think when we engage with people digitally, as opposed to in our normal environments, it kind of brings some of those things that were perhaps hidden in the other, in-person environment to the surface. And, a key thing would be about, an assumption that, well, we're in a digital environment and everyone's now a digital native. Not the case, especially if you're wanting to reach widely. And so, assuming that not everyone's a gamer, not everyone knows how these different things work. These kinds of, assumptions, I guess there's different assumptions that come into play, but engaging digitally, you now end up, with, I guess, it's a very interesting thing of like, really having to think one to one maybe, but then also trying to capitalize on, as you say, like, what did we get from those communal experiences, and when we talk to people at focus groups, they were perfectly happy to talk to strangers about a communal digital, immersive experience. But they also really liked to talk to family members and, other people. They wanted to bring their family members with them or their friends or whatever. So I guess getting the best of both worlds and, kind of unearthing, again, using the toolkit or whatever to unearth what those individualities and what the new questions and the new contexts are, that'll be important.
Ben, can I throw to you in terms of like some of the familiarity of audience behaviours here is both encouraging and inspiring, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I'd say it's kind of aspirational, because it's what, any good kind of theatrical experience should be, which is full immersion. You want to know that your audience is engaged. Certainly as a filmmaker or a storyteller, you want to know that you've got someone's attention. And there are, obviously numerous distractions in a cinema auditorium, but you are committed to the form here and fully absorbed into it. So, that's why I alluded in my intro to how, we absolutely expect to see more and more creators being drawn to this form, because you want to give people an experience, and you've got the opportunity here to do that in a way that doesn't really lend itself to anything else. I mean, as Sarah says, she's always worked in the immersive economy. This takes it to that other level that people strive for, really. I mean, like, I work at the BFI, it's the shush zone, it's like, are you actually paying attention? Did you really watch this film? Did you really watch this film? You're going to be, you're committing to live these experiences in the time that you spend with them. So that is that's so compelling to both the audience, but, especially storytellers. That's where I really feel the edges here.
Thanks, Ben. And I guess, before we and me, get carried away with some of the potential, we also, one of the pieces that Larissa talked about and is in the report is about frictions and barriers. And Simon, I just wanted to invite you to sort of reflect on some of the, these are all really positive things that we see, but we're really aware there are frictions and barriers from a social perspective, but also, from a regulatory perspective, these are not small problems. I wonder if I could invite you to say a little on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously the obvious one I'm going to mention, but given my background is that of connectivity. So, the fact is that we don't all have wonderful levels of connectivity. There is, as you know, a USO of 10 megabits per second, but that's obviously making assumptions about what people are going to be using it for. And of course, a key thing for this kind of experience is latency. So very much the things that people are looking for in connectivity, are very different in this world, particularly where, lest I say it, several people are actually engaging at the same time in a household. So that's a clear issue. You talked about the social impacts, and of course the accessibility of this technology. They're not necessarily cheap. They're getting cheaper, but these are issues about the social divides and so forth. And then of course that of harms. I sort of laughed about the padded cell earlier, but there are all sorts of different, you know what I mean? there are all sorts of different things that can affect people, including flashing images at the peripheral of your vision, all those sort of things that are measurable. And of course, other types of harm, which are probably physiological ones as well. So these kind of things are all of concern from a regulatory perspective. If I can just pick up one thing that you talked about, interactivity. You see, it's very interesting actually in the television world, with a highly interactive TV environment as we have today. It is true that the less as the interactivity goes down, the immersion goes up. If I'm just sitting back down with a beer in my hand, completely immersed in the content, I'm not pressing any buttons, I'm not touching anything. So often the traditional ways in which we think about engagement in the television world are actually turned upside down by this sort of technology.
Thanks, Simon. I think you've just scratched the surface of some of those barriers and frictions, and I think we've got a few questions in the Q&A about some of these areas that we'll pick up after the panel discussion. But I want to move on to, I think, one of the areas that's of interest, hopefully, to the audience and certainly to the panel is around the idea of VR in particular, opening up alternative perspectives and worlds to users. And Olga, you kind of led a lot of the work around thinking about this, but I wanted to invite Ben to kind of like offer a perspective on this from some of the work that you've done about working with storytellers like Dan Tucker and Darren Emerson on the Common Ground research project. And maybe you could say a little bit about that research and the impact such experiences have on audiences, and Olga can say a little bit more about what we found more widely.
Yeah, so the report James is talking about is it's called Taking VR Stories to UK Audiences, Common Ground, which is all based around Darren's film Common Ground. It was authored by Darren Emerson, Dan Tucker, and Anthony Badu-Coma, and it's available on the BFI website. You can just download it there, so check it out. It really, a lot of the report, and based on based on our input into the report, is, as I talked about early on, it's much more about how do you make this scalable? How do you take this to the widest possible audiences? So we a lot of what the report covers are things like that, about what's the the director's cut version and the actual scalable distribution version. Is it actually the way that you get this to most audiences is to ensure that there's always a 360 version of the film available. So it covers things like that largely. But in terms of the specific question around opening up vistas and stories, it does talk about there, and I know that Olga's done a lot of work here as well. Within that actual, real-time empathy was a thing. Seeing people literally seeing people able to identify and understand an issue, in this case, presented to them in such a compelling way, for them to be full of that empathy. That's, again, talking about the idea of wanting to have control of your audience and an impact on your audience. That is so compelling to a storyteller, to fully immerse your audience to the point that it changes them in real time and affects them to that extent. That's that is something that I can only see more and more people being drawn to it, and that's so specific to VR, and not just and specific to the authorship of this project as well, ensuring that it's not just VR, you are fully immersed, it's interactive, it's 3D, it's all of these things. So that's something that has come through loud and clear in that idea of really bringing audiences exploring, new vistas and storyscapes.
Olga, do you want to share a bit more about some of the findings there?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is really aligned with what Ben outlined, is that this whole discussion about VR and empathy and emotion has a lot of people arguing for it and people arguing against it, and it's quite a contentious issue. So we decided to actually search for the specificity of the medium here, what Sarah alluded to, what other people talked about, what is really, what is materially specific and special about VR, and then from there to looking at how it works, then draw conclusions about what it actually does. So the other way around, in a way. And what we found is that, and what people talked about is that VR requires a high level of commitment. There is the ceremonial commitment to get through frictions, and that's the beginning of the specificity of what it then can be, because you have to invest really heavily. Then there is this intimacy that comes from being so close to someone in the experience and breaking the personal space that you would never do in real life or in other forms, cultural forms like film. And then, of course, as Ben said, it is 3D, but it is really rooted in certain game mechanics, and the fact that it's often multi-paths, and this degree of freedoms that don't exist in other environments. And it is here where it's really different from other cultural forms, because it combines this kind of filmic, cinematic, theatrical element with the mode of behavior that comes from games. And this is like what's really new about this medium. And then this allows for the complexity of the narrative. This allows for being in a world that is constituted differently. And so in this kind of section of our report, we decide to move away from the idea of emotional empathy and actually say it's because you experience things in a different way, and you actually inhabit a world in a different world that's constructed of different things, and you move in a different way, that you can see a difference. And that's where it's kind of its political potential. That's how it's become such an interesting medium to work with.
Thanks, Olga. And maybe I could bring Casey into the conversation here about the kind of the peculiarities and particularities of VR as a medium, and how what Olga and Ben were talking about was like rewarding the viewer, and how you've approached that in the gallery in terms of understanding what, because people come to the National Gallery, right, and they come to see a painting and they quite enjoy that without any technology in the first place. So one of the interesting things for you is like, well, what's the value add of putting in technology? Because it's whilst it's an opportunity, it's also a cost to you, and it's something that audiences are putting something in front of paintings. So how do these ideas rewarding the viewers and this aspect of presence that we've talked about play into your thinking and understanding of how it rewards audiences?
Yeah, great question. I think for the gallery, it's one of the things is the gallery is a research institution first and foremost. We have this amazing collection, but we do a lot of research on our collection, and we're constantly learning new things. And so consequently, we have, you see a painting and you see a label with about 100 words, and then we've got about 18 books about that painting that sit behind that label. And so what VR has allowed us to do is to start to think about how can we provide additional context and information about these paintings in a different way that's beyond just reading a label or reading a book. And so we think about it a lot in terms of learning as well, and people who learn in different ways, who can experience the painting in more than just reading about it or just hearing an audio description of it, but how to start to understand the actual context of where that painting came from, or the scientific behind it. We have a lot of paintings where we've spent a lot of time doing x-rays, so you can see what the paintings are underneath the paintings, and that's something that you can just never see. You can't look at a painting and see the underpaintings, but we have this technology that allows us to see that. So how can we then bring that to audiences with that without making them like come into the back and say, here's our x-ray machine. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to think about how we convey a lot of this research and knowledge that we have in a way that's a bit more accessible and not just in a textbook format.
That's really interesting. I remember when we were working on Virtual Veronese, we talked about the idea of time travel and connecting audiences to those kind of like original exhibitionary contexts in order to inspire learning journeys. And Isabel, maybe you could say a little bit about how presence as an idea factored into what we were trying to connect audiences to here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a number of things that presence did at the National Gallery to improve the user experience of the painting and the story behind it. So presence there and in our other studies, we found that presence really positively affected enjoyment, repeatability, telling friends about the experience, but also things like looking up information about the painting. So the intention to do that after they've done the experience, we found that many people in our survey said, yes, I'm actually now going to look up more information about this painting because it has really engaged me and I now have that need to find out more. So that would be a great link to stimulate learning and understanding of the story behind the painting. And we found that that was higher if people were feeling that sense of presence. The intention to look up more information about the painting was higher as well.
I wonder if I could bring in Sarah here, because Sarah, I wonder from your point of view, like this partly what Casey and Isabel are talking about there, that engagement and what we talked about before about the onboarding and the process starts much earlier. Are you finding that it continues much longer as well, that it inspires journeys to go on and have a longer relationship with the RSC? And maybe Casey, I'll bring you in as well. Like, is that something that you're seeing more widely? But Sarah, to you first, and I'll come back to Casey.
I think there's huge potential there. I think that for a long time in this space, we've been broadcasting, and actually now it's about distributed sort of world building exercises, and how also we don't have this homogenized relationship with our audience, but we have more personalized relationships with our audiences. And I think like what the toolkit is bringing out and what you're discussing today is that it's the breaking down of the types of audiences and how we bring that together and how you bring those, or you find those forms of connection. But it is it's really interesting to look at emotion and how you create and build emotion and relationships in this space. And for a long time, you know, the best storytelling technology there is a live actor, and how that live actor conveys that to you. So we've got to look at the relationships and the emotional connections between the technologies and the tools and the people and the audiences, and it's got to come together in a slightly different way if we're to sort of forge the new forms, which I think we all see the potential in. And part of that is maintaining the relationship with our audiences, not only when they come to us to take part in a performance, but how we maintain those relationships when they leave, and how we maintain connection, because again, our devices we are connected all the time. So it is much more pervasive about how we have our relationships with news, how we have our relationships with social media, how we have our relationships with what content we decide and when. And for example, when we want to be collective and be part of a live experience together, or when we want to watch something that's streamed and binge watch something on our own, these are choices we're making, but the access to that is pervasive and happening all around us all the time. That's a fundamental structural shift for us. I'm excited by it, but it will take a lot of R&D and realize, you know, I think it's really important to look at mass and personalized experiences at the same time to achieve that.
Yeah, that's really true. In terms of, and we're going to come on shortly into a conversation about how you conceive of kind of like evaluating success and those kind of things in a moment. But I think the question of ongoing relationship, and maybe Kate, if I could bring you in to just reflect on whether Immersive is offering you that opportunity. I'll then sort of bring in Polly about how emotion might connect to something that offers that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think It does. I think part of I guess I'll give a brief context of visualizing Veronese for those of you who are unfamiliar with the project. Basically, we had a curator, Dr. Rebecca Gill, did some significant research on a painting by Veronese. And what she did was find the original church that it had been commissioned for in, I think, the 1500s. And the National Gallery went down and 3D scanned the church. It still existed. And so we were able to put the painting, which now lives in the National Gallery, in its original context of where it was painted for, as well as this provide the story of why it was commissioned in the first place, because it ended up being quite a complicated and interesting story about an abbot appeasing the church or trying to appease the church after being seen as potentially contentious and things like that, and which is a story that is difficult to tell normally, but what allowed us to happen was in VR, we could then, bring that painting into the actual experience. What this then did was allow us to think about how we could then start to look at other paintings in the collection as well, which then creates this repeat engagement. And so, yes, there is an element of people wanting to, people came to the gallery not realizing that this kind of experience existed. They stumbled upon it in the gallery. They then got to see what it was like to experience the painting in its original setting. And then oftentimes they would say, well, what else can we see like this? And so then you start to have that, and the answer was nothing yet. Because, as many people have mentioned, it is a complicated process and it's often quite costly. But the whole part of the point of this project was to see if this was something that we could then do with other paintings. And so to imagine in a future where we could provide this experience for different paintings throughout the gallery, and to start to contextualize it and even potentially provide empathy for what that painting was like in its historical context. It led to a lot of people wanting to do further research about the painting. And, Veronese, the painting is interesting, but it wasn't necessarily one of the stars of our collection, but it became a painting that people became quite interested in, even though previously it had been just sort of in the corner of a room.
Yeah, a very nice room.
Yeah, true. And it's a beautiful painting.
And maybe, Polly, I could bring you in to say a little bit about what we found with emotion in that story as something that, people with both what Sarah and Casey have talked about is looking to try and provoke specific types of reactions and responses and relationships with audiences. Could you say a little bit about what we found in trying to study that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a nice lead in. Thanks, Casey, from the Veronese project, because that was one where one of the intentions was to, because the original context of the painting was in a religious kind of devotional setting of a chapel, the idea to elicit some related emotions to that was behind some of the design of the experience. And so we did find that we were able to, there was this emotion that we found called kama mutta, which is Sanskrit for moved by love, which is this religious type feeling of a devotion type emotion. And so not everybody felt it, but a small proportion of the visitors reported feeling that very effectively. And another really interesting thing, and it's linking up with this discussion about building onward relationships from those National Gallery findings, was also people who agreed with the statement that the narrative affected them emotionally somehow. Were also more likely to say that they would tell their friends about the experience. So I think there's really interesting potential here for looking at those links between the emotions that somebody feels during an experience, and then how that might affect their onward behaviour in terms of whether it might be the relationship with the people who've given them that experience, or potentially, whether they tell their friends about it, whether they want to repeat it as well.
And I'm going to start bringing in some questions from the audience now, but sort of one last one to Sarah before I do is this thing of emotion, and one of the things that Polly said in the presentation and the report was that happiness was kind of like a really obvious one. You made people happy. They kind of went, oh yeah, I get that, and I want to. Have you, with your experience, found targeting a particular emotion? Have you found specific emotional responses that resonate across experiences that you think are worth sharing?
I mean, ultimately, I think arts and culture and its purpose is to be transformed. And there's something about whether you go to a gallery, whether you go to the theatre, whether you go to a cinema, there is a jeopardy in your connection with what is being shared with you. So whether that's happiness or whether that's anger or whether that's sadness or whether that's grief or whatever that emotional connection is, that is the why and why arts and culture tells those stories so brilliantly. But it's also the risk taking around that. And what we must take a beat on is not homogenizing or forgetting that is a massive why for an audience connection with storytelling, to be transformed, to put an idea out there and for you to reflect and think about it, for you to go in with an opinion and then maybe come out with a different one or have that reaffirmed. And also when it's shared, to experience that with others and feel what they are feeling, either as a form of togetherness or a form of difference. That's super exciting when we look at emotion in this way. And I think that's again, with the new tools that we have at our disposal, it is really kind of using that emotional connection as a starting point. It's like, why does the story need to be told? What is the connectivity of that? Really matters. So however audiences feel, the fact they show up is an absolute delight to us. And in this moment, in this pandemic, that showing up actually was actually more what we needed as makers as well. And let's not forget that too. We needed to know our audiences were there.
That's great. And I suspect something that I've forgotten and many of us will have forgotten is that emotional buzz that you get from just being part of an audience. not quite the same here. Trying to get it. So I want to bring in questions from the audience, and we've got a couple of similar ones around thinking about barriers and types of content being available. B, can I ask you to bring in Susan Hung for first question?
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I didn't realize that we were going to be asking our own questions.
we thought it's nice to give the audience a voice.
No, my question was really around content, and I know that you did your study on audiences mostly, but I was curious about, if one of the barriers to audience participation is around, the amount of content, the options that are available, as was mentioned previously, what kind of barriers do you see for creative producers of this content in terms of getting more good value content that people want to see?
Thank you, Susan. It's such a good question. I'm going to throw to Larissa first, but Ben, that might be something that you might want to jump in on as well in terms of kind of like experience you've had at the BFI. But Larissa?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, and I think it's a question about thinking about what the medium is best at, likely, and thinking about building those experiences that are really where that medium really adds something. I think one of the things that our users talked about was even simple content, like they strangely really liked this free app called Bait on the Oculus Store. They spent a lot of time in there because it's like, it's an environment, it's peaceful, and you just repetitively fish. You just fish. And several people talked about, I love to go in there after a stressful day. And another one called BOGO, where again, it's an environment and they go in and they interact with an animal. And I think that those sort of environmental things that enclose people and encapsulate them and take them away, help them escape, that's the kinds of content that they're looking for. So while I can't really speak necessarily to barriers for creatives as an audience researcher, I can say that thinking about what audiences value about that immersive experience will help us to make those decisions.
Thanks, Larissa. And Ben, maybe, I don't know if you've got any reflections, I don't want to put you on the spot, but just in terms of the BFI kind of like commissioning and research experience, whether that has something that you've got reflections on?
It's early days. I mean, a lot of stuff comes to us quite a late stage of development. So, you know, we're certainly keen to understand more from the creators we work with about the frustrations or limitations that they do experience. I mean, I know from, you know, attending StoryFutures labs, for example, that, you know, the actual the budget potentials within the various games engines, you know, that you can create is finite. So you might go at it with the biggest possible ambition and then realize your limitations quite quickly into the actual production of it. So quite basic things like that, I think, will be the obvious frustrations about, you know, that any creative will face, not being able to obviously deliver on your fullest vision of execution. But no, we'll continue to listen to our filmmakers.
And maybe, I mean, this just to bring in Sarah and Casey, is like when you're, you know, different roles in your different institutions, but when you're starting to think about the role that immersive can play, at what point do you start thinking about the specificity of the audience, like you know, use that dreaded term like KPIs, like what are the KPIs that you kind of like look to measure as a way of understanding success? Because we often talk about, you know, reach versus depth, you know, and whether, you know, often with immersive you're able to get the latter a lot more, and therefore thinking really specifically about what it is you're trying to get with audiences. What sort of points and when do you start getting specific about those research ideas and research metrics?
Shall I go? I think Simon touched on it too earlier. Is like, for example, if we're reaching a mass audience and thinking about accessibility and inclusion, we have to start with our audience question at the very, very beginning. And so like for Dream, when we had this very, very painful pivot in the pandemic to create a piece of work that did access 100,000 audiences, we did commission a really strong piece of research to inspire us, actually, in order for us to have a creative response. And in that, the audience research exposed a huge digital inequity in people's homes. Yet we have seen our homes become cultural spaces and imaginative spaces and co-curated spaces with us. And if we are looking at immersive technology, we have to absolutely accept there is a huge digital inequity out there. Therefore, it is not, it's not necessarily a question of storytelling that we're dealing with at the moment. We're dealing with a question of equity and infrastructure. And that has to be addressed if a lot of this work can scale, whether that's really intimate or whether that's looking at a mass audience. It's a pervasive issue.
Yeah, it's stuff that we can't lose sight of, and a challenge of kind of accessibility and where you provide those points of access, which for live venues, you know, is obviously really important. Casey, did you want to jump in on anything there?
Yeah, I just wanted to completely agree with Sarah. I think, you know, we almost start with audiences first, and because I think we're at a point in immersive experiences where there is no standard and there is no norm yet. Whereas, you know, in website development, for example, you know, we've been building websites for so many years now that there are certain things that we can say, we know that this is accessible, this is not accessible. So you don't necessarily need to test those things as much anymore. But when it comes to immersive experiences, there's still so many unknowns that if we don't start from an audience perspective, then we can really easily accidentally go down a path that isn't accessible or isn't meeting needs. And, you know, unfortunately, because a lot of this technology is relatively expensive to build, it's not a situation we want to be in. So, you know, we, from the gallery perspective, we always sort of lay out at the very beginning, who is this audience we actually think this is for, so that we don't, and we try not to lose sight of that through that process, because otherwise, you know, it can very easily go in a completely different direction that can end up being quite costly if we need to fix it.
Yeah, Yeah, the cost question is always important when decisions become pretty locked in. I'm going to bring in another question from our audience, and if I could invite B to bring Nina in, who's asked a really interesting question around immersion, presence, and embodiment. Thanks, Nina.
Hi everybody. Yes, so the third aspect of my understanding of VR and immersive is an embodiment. And this comes from my experience as a storyteller within the medium of dance and movement. But the feeling that the virtual body is your avatar in the virtual space is the physical body. And so from this study and your expertise in creating immersive experiences, what ways can, thinking about embodiment and the entire body be incorporated into the experience so that the virtual and biological body are more aligned and potentially lead to what I call a more authentic feeling experience in the immersive space, so that we can have experiences that feel more real as humans, as we interact with each other and as we experience storytelling in the immersive space.
Thanks, Nina. It's such a good question. And thankfully, we have the psychology team here to answer. So I'm going to pass over to Isabel first, and she's going to bring in Polly, I think.
Great. Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you so much for bringing that up. There's a couple elements. For example, when in VR, AR, we see an avatar, and let's say we see that avatar copy movements that we do. As for example, we stand in front of a mirror in VR or AR, and when we lift our arms, the avatar, the person in the experience, does that as well. That really creates that connection, that feeling that it is real, and that actually the avatar you're seeing in the mirror, for example, is you. It really creates that bond, and it creates that feeling of realness, therefore presence. And that effect has really been used in, for example, embodied VR before, to reduce different types of biases. So gender bias, racial bias, and other biases like that. And it's also been used to reduce low self-esteem and other psychological aspects like that. So it can be used very effectively. And as you rightly mentioned, movement and motion is a strong element in that, because if you can link the feeling that you're moving and you see that movement repeated, that really creates that bond, connection, and presence. I hope that starts to answer your question. Polly, would you like to build on that, please?
Thanks. Yeah, just to agree with everything you said, Isabel, I think it's a really interesting question, and especially as in many immersive experiences, perhaps depicting a virtual body itself is not always the starting point of thinking about the experience. There can be tendency to think about the rest of the world, and some experiences obviously just don't depict a virtual body at all. So I think it's a particularly interesting question for a cognitive psychologist, because there's a long history of research suggesting that our sense of body ownership is quite malleable. And like you say, Isabel, with with interactions in a multisensory context where vision and movement match up, then I don't think that we necessarily need to have body parts that look particularly convincing necessarily, but it's if that interaction is convincing and that multi-sensory behavior fits together across the different senses, then that can give quite a convincing sense of embodiment, I think. But I think it's a really interesting question, and loads more research to be done.
That's a perfect segue, Polly. Loads more research to be done. We're at the end of our session, and there is loads more research to be done, and that's what we're going to keep doing. And we will have further updates in the year ahead. But thank you so much to so many of you for attending today, and to our panel for being such brilliant conversants on a really exciting but also tricky subject, kind of like, understand how audience perception then marries into success. So thanks Ben, Sarah, Casey, Simon had to dive off for another Ofcom event, but thank you all, and to the wonderful researchers who've actually pulled all of this together. B, can I hand back to you for kind of like last housekeeping notices, mate?
Of course, of course. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming. As James said, I will be popping back in the chat the link to where you can download the report. Just popped it in there for you. We have been actually live social mediaing all of this over our socials at StoryFutures and at StoryFuturesA. So if you want to go back and give that some love, we would very much love that. And yeah, we will also be recording this. This has been recorded today, and it will be going on the StoryFutures Academy YouTube page in the near future. We will be releasing all of that. So if you missed anything today, you will be able to go back and watch that. And that is my housekeeping done.